Hi, everyone, and welcome to week four. For week four, we're going to be talking about the audience. I'm having a little trouble with Screencast-O-Matic today, so I'm going to do a video introduction and then we're just going to switch to looking at the PowerPoint. Some of you might prefer that. I'm not sure if you like having your professor in the bottom corner of the screen. I think it gives you something to look at and makes it feel a bit more personal. But for this week, we're going to go straight into the PowerPoint after this introduction. So like I said, we're going to be talking about audience this week. And the simplest definition of audience is the readers or users of your document who are going to do something with your document in whatever format you've delivered it to them in. So we're going to start historically and go back to Aristotle, of course, and then we're going to go all the way up to Shriver. And as you listen to the lecture, I want you to evaluate and take different pieces from different theories and merge together what you think the definition of audience is. You may not find that you agree completely with any one definition, and that's okay, but make sure that you pull out the sections that you do agree with and use that for your upcoming projects. As always, if you have any questions for me, reach out on the board or in the email. By now, I should have my Drexel email set up, so hopefully that won't cause any more problems. Thanks, and I look forward to talking to you in week 5. Hi, everyone. Like I mentioned, we're just going to go through the slides for this week. So again, this is week 4, and the lecture is going to focus on audience. So we want to start out with what is audience. As I mentioned in the intro, it's in the simplest form, readers or users of the document for whom we are writing, who are going to do something with the document in whatever format we've delivered it in. In a lot of cases, they're going to use it to perform tasks, but they're all working in different contexts and domains, and they're also working in rhetorical constraints. So anytime we're involved in creating, writing, or listening, or reading, or using, we're bound by these various elements that impact how we complete that action. The rhetorical situation or triangle focuses on the interactions between all of the players. So that's writer, the reader, and the purpose. And you can see I've listed that out on the screen just to give you a visual of it. And regardless of the role that we have, we approach the situation with certain goals in mind. So as a writer, it's generally going to be to create a doc that can be used by a particular reader in a particular context, whereas for a reader, the goal is generally something more related to completing a task. And again, we're going to be looking at the purpose. Why does the reader need it? Why is the writer producing it? And thus we kind of think about the document and who we're creating it for, and we keep all of their needs in mind. And we also have to consider that the document takes place in a broader context. It's the context of a corporation or the context of the environment that the user is in and where they are using the document. So all of these are going to affect how we're going to design the document. Now, historically, of course, we're going to go back to Aristotle. For Aristotle, his audience was hearers, and that just means that people were sitting and listening to them. There weren't a lot of people who could read and write in ancient Greece, so for Aristotle, he had people sitting in front of him that were listening to him speak. And you could even say that today I have an audience. My audience is all of you guys that are listening to me. While I don't, however, have the benefit of having the live audience as Aristotle is, of course, the benefit being that he could look out, see faces, see reactions. He could change his delivery or his speech, his tone of voice, anything that would help him persuade the audience. And again, that's because he was right in front of them. For this situation, when I'm giving a lecture, I don't have the benefit of seeing your faces. Right now, you can't actually even see my face. You may have watched the introduction, and that was kind of one-sided. You saw me presenting, but right now you can't see if I'm gesturing with my hands. I also can't see if you've started to get bored or if you have a puzzled look, which might signal that you have a question. These are all things that I lose by not having the live audience. And you can assume that when you have a live audience, you can assume questions and whether or not people are paying attention, and you can shift your communication or the argument to get your audience's support. So once we get to the 20th century, audience becomes a more integral part of the writing process, and a number of processes are developed to acknowledge what audience is and then how you should approach it. So one approach argued is that the author should use his or herself as the audience. So what that means is that if you present a clean and an effective argument that you personally agree with, this can be extended to the user. So basically, if I'm persuaded by my argument, the user will be. And this is the idea of writing as art, as a means of discussion. Now, rhetorician Ong said that the audience is always fiction. One creates for and imagines an audience. Michael Perelman argued that there is a universal audience and that we create text for that group. And then currently, probably the most popular name is going to be Kenneth Burke. And Kenneth Burke argued that the function of language is to promote cooperation. So you can kind of see how that's going to be different from Aristotle. Aristotle, he wants to win the argument. And Kenneth Burke, he wants to encourage the cooperation. He wants to reach a compromise. It's not necessarily about winning. It's about reaching a common ground with your audience. And all of these approaches are really important for tech writers because it gives us different mechanisms to evaluate the audience. So whether we're seeing that audience as real or as imagined, it's critical to our profession. Now, all of these approaches, as I said, are really important to technical communicators, and they help provide us with mechanisms that we can use to understand the audience. But during the last few decades, I would say going back to the 60s and 70s, writers start to draw on other areas to understand the audience. Cognitive psychology becomes one important source for readers and how they react to something. Another theoretical influence is reader response theory, and in that, meaning is created in the mind of the reader, and we have to think about the mind of the reader. So while this almost sounds like sort of an anything goes philosophy, it really works alongside of cognitive psychology in saying that there's power in the user, and as the writer, we need to understand that. Now, in part, these approaches lead to research on how people work, what they do, how they use texts, and direct observation really helps us to work with this. A final influence I want to discuss is social construction theory. And in social construction theory, the reader is really going to play an active role here. We need to understand the context the document is being written and used in. We need to know something about the corporate context. There might be situational constraints that are put on us. We also need to understand the role of ethics. We need to apply the appropriate ethical standards. So we don't want to create a text that is misleading in any way or gives room for someone to misinterpret our meaning. So what this really means is that we want to think about the audience within the context that they work in, and that involves looking at users in their workplace. And this could be ethnographic studies, where researchers go out and observe writers and readers in the workplace. And there's no really bad ways to work with any of the methods that I've outlined here. You can also see user analysis and usability test. We're going to be talking about those more in week 5, but there's no real bad way to approach this. Some are good, some are better. There's going to be certain limitations. You may have heard me say in past lectures that readability formulas do have limitations. It doesn't mean that readability formulas are not helpful. It just means that you might need to combine it with another source. Now, going back to Shriver, if you're following along in your text, it's going to be on pages 154 to 163. But Shriver summarizes 3 different methods of audience of what I've just described. So the first one is a classification-driven audience, which is a mechanism where we try to get as much information out of the target audience as possible. So that means we do things like create personas, we gather demographics to try to learn as much about the audience as we can. To create things for that level, we might create categories like novice or expert to describe the different types of readers. Now, the second one is intuition driven, and that's where we, as the writer or creator, create or imagine the audience. We create our own construct of what the reader is. And you could argue that this is going to be limited, but we don't want to dismiss it because we want to come up with a sense of who the audience is prior to testing real users. A good way to create It's good to create an imaginary audience in hopes of finding who your target audience would be to do the user testing. So for example, if your product is targeting the construction industry, you probably wouldn't go out and just do usability testing to anyone who comes off of the street. We want to make sure that we have someone that knows that industry and that can provide valuable feedback to improve the product. And then finally is where the third one, I just touched on this a little bit, is feedback driven. And that's where we get data from our audience, from real audiences, I should say, and we use that feedback to create more effective documents. And again, we're going to be talking about usability testing more in week 5, and you're also going to be doing a usability test as your second project. And then finally, I want to suggest that the info we gain from finding out about audience is more dynamic and it's really not static. We can use the information in the future. We can use the information to apply to new situations. And really, as we go forward, we're refining our methods for testing. You're going to find out what works, what doesn't, and then we can create benchmarks and rules that apply to that target audience. Once we know the target audience, we create a living document that we change as the audience is going to change and as readers develop. But the initial document serves as a means to really just educate and train new employees or possibly new departments. And I want to expand on that a little bit about audiences changing. One thing that you could consider now is a lot of you are going to be in the millennial generation. There's been a lot of studies of how baby boomers versus millennials deal with documents. Do they want videos? Do they want text? Do they want to read? Do they want something with sound? Do they want something flashy? It really can depend on who your audience is. A lot of companies now are dealing with younger people entering the workforce, so they might need to change their documentation to focus on the needs of those users because they might have different needs. You can think of that again as that living document that you're going to keep updating it for who your audience is as they change throughout the future. And that's going to conclude the lecture for week 4. If you do have any questions about audience, make sure to reach out to me. This is something that you should be referencing throughout your projects going forward. All right, thanks, and I'll talk to you in week 5.